welcome to the Writer's Journey podcast, episode number 3. My name is Mark and I am your host for the show. Today I don't have a guest. I'm actually going to be talking direct about the first draft. So if you'd rather not listen to me just kind of talk about the first draft and how I got there, what I did in my second and third draft, some of the tools I used and how I developed my characters a little bit. If you're not interested in any of that, then just wait for the next episode, which will have an author. So every second episode, I'll do a little bit of talking, and then we'll have authors in between. Part of the writer's journey is the journey from not really knowing some of the tools that are available, exploring those tools, talking about it, figuring out what works for you or what works for other people. So in today's episode, talking about writing the first draft. I think one of the first things that stuck out for me was just making sure I did a little bit of writing every day. I actually created a spreadsheet, and in the spreadsheet I had in one column each day for 90 days. So I had 90 days with the dates of each day, and I had how many words I wrote that day. I had how many I needed to write to hit about 75,000 words over 90 days, because my goal was to finish the whole book within 90 days and have it roughly end at 75,000 words or so. And so I needed to write about 800 and something. I don't quite remember exactly how many, 840 maybe words per day. So I had it calculated on an Excel spreadsheet, and it tabulated how much I'd written, so where I stood right now with how many words I had written in the story, and what my goal, where should I be with my goal. So there were days where I didn't write at all. There were days where I wrote a lot. I think for the most part I wrote just about every day, even if it was a little bit. I think it's really important to write a little bit every day, even if you just go to the page, open the computer and type in a few sentences. It just gets the creative juices flowing, which is really helpful in getting more words done, because sometimes you surprise yourself. You think, oh, I don't have anything to write, I'm not into it today, I'm just tired, and then all of a sudden you jump and you start writing and you realize that, oh, well, now I got this sentence, I can keep typing, I got that sentence. So that works for me, having that accountability, having that goal. Even if I didn't hit the daily goal, I felt okay with it, because overall I was on average above where I needed to be. I ended up finishing the book in something like 80 days, 79 days, 80 days, the first draft of the book. And having the extra 10 days to start working on the second draft. You'll hear people talk about whether or not you should step away from the book for 3 or 4 months. Because I planned to self-publish, I didn't want to go the trad pub kind of theory of waiting that much time before going into the next draft. And really with self-publishing, from all the research I've done, you want to put out books quite often, 3, 4, or 5 books a year, really whatever you can. My goal has been set for kind of 3 books a year is what I'm hoping to be able to accomplish, which I still think is quite ambitious, even if they're 75, 80,000 word books. It's still a challenge, especially if you're, in my case, I have a family, I have a full-time job, and I'm just trying to fit in writing and balance that along with exercising, which is another big part of my life. So it can be challenging to fit it all in. So I think 3 books a year is already very ambitious. I also want to do writing conferences, and right now there's not a lot going on. There are conferences that you can do as webinars, which are great because you can sign up and you don't have to go anywhere, you don't have to travel, there's no other expenses, you literally just throw your headphones on and learn. But you also lose out in the connecting with other people, making friends in the writing community, and just getting to know other authors. And I think for a first-time author like me, it's really important to be able to get that connection, which I'm missing out on, unfortunately, with the COVID-19 and everything. But that's okay. I'm just going to take it a step at a time and get the most out of what I can with what's going on, and just hope I can do better from there. So depending on if you're a discovery writer or an outliner, I talked a little bit about this in the last episode. I happen to be more of a discovery writer, and I think that'll probably change a bit in the second draft or the second story. So the story I'm working on right now is technically set to be a trilogy. I like the idea of writing in trilogies. If I go back to the same world in a new trilogy, I'd rather have different characters in a different part of that same world, or the kids or grandkids of those same characters. I really liked that Terry Brooks did that in his series, and even though mine isn't necessarily quest stories like his, where I still like the idea of having that generations gap and seeing what happened each generation, and how we, in my case, because it's urban fantasy, how we rebuilt, because the world was beat up a little bit and a lot of people died from a biological weapon, and that's part of the story that I'm working on right now. So if you are a discovery writer like me, I did not do very much outlining for the first story. I was just really excited about getting started, and I went to the page and I really just started typing. The issue with that is that when you get to the end of your first draft, it's a really, really rough first draft, because if you didn't really know your characters, if you only had a vague idea of what the story was going to be, it's probably the most fun thing to write, because you're not really worried about... I didn't stop and focus on having all these different plot lines hit and making sure these characters did all the right things along the way in order to hit the plot points that I needed, because I didn't outline it. So that makes it a lot of fun, but it also makes it a lot of work in the next step. So draft 2, and currently working on draft 3, but chapter 12 and draft 3, it's been a lot of work, because I'm trying to connect character voices. Now, the other thing I did, I don't know if I would say an error, because I really liked how it worked out in the story, but for a first-time writer, it's very challenging, because I put in 3 different viewpoint characters in the story. They're family members, so the son, the father, and the grandfather, and how they interact, and the stories about that journey that each one of them has to take. And that was a big challenge to write all those different voices and to try and keep track of those different voices, to make them sound like unique characters. They're all different ages, and it's a pretty big challenge. So in hindsight, should I have written a book with one character? I don't know. This was the character. This was the story I wanted to write. It was a story that I wanted to tell in the way I wanted to tell it. So I'm glad I did, and I'm glad I told the story, but it is a lot of work. So one thing to consider when you're looking at viewpoint characters, there's minor characters and there's major characters, but if you are going to be doing major characters and you're going to have multiple major characters, it really helps to flesh out who those people are. The one thing I've been doing with that, because I'm more of a discovery writer, so I do have a tendency to lean toward discovery writing, what I've done with that is I've tried to take things, make a list of very general things that each character, each personality will have for most of my major and minor characters. Now this is draft 2 that I'm looking at. And I'm doing that so that I have a vague idea of how they'll react in given situations, but I don't know exactly how they'll react, because that's the discovery part that I like. So I started labeling what type of personality are they? Are they like an analytical thinker? Are they a driver? Are they amiable? Are they very expressive? Are they going to be offensive or defensive? When something happens to them, will they want to defend, or they want to go on the offensive? So it's very general to think of a character in that way, because it's not specific to the character. It's like I'm just telling you rather than showing you, but I'll show when the story comes, because I know that's who I need that character to be. There's about 10 or 15 things that I'm looking at in all those different kinds of personalities. Another one, are they happy? Do they laugh a lot? Are they angry? Are they frustrated easily? So I try and put those things together, because they're very general, and then I take that and I work the discovery into the story with that character. When I didn't have that in draft 1, and then putting this into draft 2, when I didn't have it in draft 1, the characters were all very similar, and it's been a challenge to change their voices and who they are. Because when you're discovery writing, it's very difficult to shift from person to person. It has been for me so far. I'm sure with enough practice that would change. Maybe a lot of you listening to this or watching this don't have that problem, but it is a problem that I experienced right off the get-go, having a hard time, even though I write it all down, who this person is, and as I write it down and I keep writing the story, I write more things down, I still found it a challenge to really feel like I was that person, to really get into that person's head. Maybe that's like part of being an actor, and I'm sure, I mean, it all comes with practice, but we are talking first drafts here, so that was my experience. So outlining your characters, I think, is a little bit more important than I gave it. So draft two, or second story, when I start building it, I plan to, one I already mentioned, is give myself a general idea of who this person is, not in depth necessarily, and find, I guess, pictures of what I want them to look like. Because the other thing is, it's really, when you have enough characters in a book, it's really easy to jump into another character and to throw in a quick thing about what they look like, but then you forget to go back to it, you forget what they look like. Having a picture, if you add a personality to that picture in your mind, it's easier to connect to your character, which is something I didn't do in book one, regretfully. So I guess I learned a lot of lessons along the way with book one, and looking forward to getting to book two. So second draft of my novel, I went through, because I had the 3 different character voices, I went through the story actually one voice at a time. So if the son was speaking, I only did the chapters where the son was speaking to try and be a little bit more on point with who they were as a person and how their story flowed, so that I knew, even though the story breaks up the viewpoints, I wanted to make sure that if you only liked the son and you skipped everything else, you'd still get a very good idea of everything that happened in the story. Not that I would want anyone to skip it, but I wanted to have that kind of flow to the story. Because, I mean, you don't know this until you read it, but the 3 of them end up splitting up and kind of going their separate ways. So draft 2 is, fixing up a lot of things. Draft 3 that I've been through so far is a lot about the English and the grammar and making passive voice active, adding more detail, making the story come alive a little bit more. I think there's going to be work to do. I'm going to send the third draft when I'm done. I'm going to send it to some beta readers, but I know there's going to be more work to do after that, because I know there's going to be things that were in my mind that maybe people want fleshed out a little bit more. I do description, but my story, I love a fast-paced action. I love a story that just moves. So in this case, the story moved very quickly, and every draft I kind of went through, I've been adding and trying to add as much detail to bring the world alive a little bit more. Because I'm working in the world that is already our own, even though like a lot of people have died and the population is kind of wiped out, it's still only been 40 years or so, so it's not, the world wouldn't have changed so much. A neighborhood's a neighborhood, houses are houses, downtown is downtown, so I add descriptors, but there's only so much I really want to do to bring that to life. I really focus more on the characters, and that's and moving very quickly among the characters. So even my character descriptions about what they look like, I don't touch on very often. It's more about who they are. So those are all things I expect that my beta reader is going to bring up and say, okay, I need to know, a little bit more about this character here and there, and I don't even feel like I don't know what they look like. One controversy you always read about is how much to leave to the imagination of the reader versus how much to describe every detail, and whether or not every detail is adding to the story in the sense that you're saying it because it means something, because you're going to come back to it, or if you're just saying it because you want to bring your world to life. And I don't think there's any right or wrong in that. It's just literally what you enjoy doing and what you want to write about. So for me, I like fast pace, I like action, I like character development. I'm not so good at describing world, and that's just one of those things that I'm going to be working on. I read a lot. I think that's an important part of draft one, and even just being a better writer is reading a lot of books. Stephen King, you can see a bunch of the books from some of my favorite authors behind me there. Lee Child, Liam Gives a Hat on the last podcast episode, of course, Terry Brooks, John Grisham, Barbara Freck, and I already mentioned Stephen King, Canadian writer Guy Gabriel Kay, Michael Connelly, of course, Neil Gaiman, brilliant writer that he is on here. So I do a lot of reading, and probably read a book every week or two, give or take, depending on how it's going. And reading with my kids, which I'm trying to do more often, especially with coronavirus right now. I'm trying to create more of a pattern with them and reading. So I read some of their children's books. The Graveyard Book, actually, reading right now with my son Matthew, and that's a Neil Gaiman book. Magnus Chase, reading with my older son James. So there's quite a book. I guess I got quite a few books on the go, on top of reading books for authors that I'm going to be interviewing upcoming, because I want to be able to talk to them about their story and how they came up with different things in their writing journey, as I'm talking now about mine. Even though you haven't read the book, and if you got this far in listening, hopefully you'll be interested in the book someday, or someday has already come 5 years from now when you're listening to this or watching this, and you're actually interested in how I got from point A to point B. I don't know how many people document the journey like this, but I think it's going to be pretty cool to see what happens, and for me to share that. But I want to do it every second episode. I know with some podcasts, it drives me nuts when I start a podcast. I want to hear a certain author speak or what's going on, and you spend 20 minutes to a half an hour listening to the author talk about what they got going on. And that's great when you really care about the author and you want to know everything they have going on. But I think with podcasts, personally, I'd rather just get right to the show and then hear about them after, because the show is usually what I'm going after, or the certain author that I want to listen to is what I'm usually going after. And since nobody really knows me personally, I don't want to talk too much about myself in an episode where people just want to hear the guests that I have on. Another tool that I have been working on for novel number 2 is Scribner, and I've heard from the research I've done, it's kind of a love and hate it thing. I think so far I've worked with it a little bit. I did some tutorials on how to use it, and just like everybody says, it is a lot for a program. It's confusing at first. I don't have the hang of it yet, but I do plan to use it for my second draft or my second novel, just because of the way it lays out. So I like that I can have all my characters there. I like the post-it note concept, and I can have pictures there. I can have character description. I can have those templates there, and it's all in one file where I need it, when I need it. So that's a real big draw. So I'm looking at that for story number 2, and you will hear from me again on how it's going and how story number 2 is doing, and we'll see if Scrivener works out or if I go back to Word. With my first draft, it was just a Word document. I have characters in a folder and in an Excel spreadsheet. I have essentially, it's kind of like Scrivener, but it's just broken up a whole bunch of different files and file folders, rather than just being a click away in a program like Scrivener. Post-it notes I think are really cool as reminders and ways to organize with different colors and what you've looked at and what you haven't looked at, kind of thing with Scrivener, which is cool. So I will let you know. I am using Pro Writing Aid in my third draft now, so I just kind of flipped it on and to see how that will go. I think Pro Writing Aid's been a pretty cool tool. It highlights so the passive voice has been a big one. And simple things, commas that I neglect to put in on longer sentences. But that's been, I like it. There's a lot of great breakdown. You can look at, if you're overusing a certain word too many times, it makes suggestions on how many words you should cut, or how many times you should cut that specific word to be a little bit more reasonable, find another way to say it, kind of thing. So that's really useful. And I'll be using it again, and I'm actually going to have it turned on for Scrivener because there's a plugin for it, so I'm going to have it on to see how it works as I write, so there's a little bit less work in the rewriting. I actually think book number 2 is probably going to be a much better book because I'm just that much more organized about it, but I guess that's kind of the way, it's always that way when it comes to to writing books, right? If you didn't get better with every book, then something's wrong. Every book should teach you something. Every book should get a little bit better if you're still trying to learn, if you're still reading, doing all those right things. So yeah, I'm really excited for book number 2 and the editing process. Actually, I haven't minded it too much. It's just the time that it takes. I started writing this book, draft 1, version 1, book 1, in February. So I finished February, March. Near the end of April, I finished the first draft. May, I finished the second draft. Now May, going into June, finishing up the third draft. So it's really been 5 months, which is a lot longer than I wanted to work on a single book, or at least I wanted to start and have the second book going by now. But I've found the issue with that is because it's a series, I have to be really careful about how I develop certain characters or what I do in book 1, because it's going to impact book 2 and what I hope to do. And that's a tricky part with a series, especially as a new author, when you're learning so much about writing. At least in my experience so far with a series, is that if you want to do something with a certain character, or you want to develop the story a certain way later, if you've already published one book, then you have to follow those rules for book 2 and book 3, even if you haven't fleshed them out as much as you would like to, or you want to go in a different direction than you thought you should. So if you are writing book number 1 of a series, I guess other than keeping in mind the different points of view, it's way easier to stick with one. The other one would be sticking with not publishing until you actually write more of the books. Not that I've published yet, but when I do, hopefully I will have written a good chunk of book number 2, and if I need to make changes to book number 1, I can still throw in some of those changes. With editing, I also used an Excel spreadsheet for tracking how many words I was editing, or how many pages, actually not words, how many pages I was editing. I think I added about 4,000 words to the story in draft 2. I haven't checked draft 3 where I stand, but I'm going to assume I've probably knocked off a few thousand, so maybe kind of right back where I was, but a better story, which is the goal. I want to quickly touch on social media. So this is one thing, one piece of advice you get a lot, and this is because I noticed when I'm looking at how to write better, how to publish books, there's always someone who wants to sell you something, which can be challenging because, should I buy this certain program from this certain person who says they can do this for me? And a lot of it are scams. So that's a challenge. And social media, when it comes to social media, one of the tips everyone gives is to start building your audience, so that when your book comes out, you have an audience who wants to purchase your book. I think in my experience so far, be careful. I guess I have this podcast that I'm talking on before I publish my book, obviously, because it's like a journal, but be mindful that don't put too much emphasis on social media to the point where you're not doing as much writing. That's where I'm starting to make that error too, where I'm thinking about, followers and likes and page likes and whether or not I'm getting enough of those. And it's challenging in the beginning because, I don't have a book. So who is going to follow my page? Although, even this video right now, if you are listening, watching, it's probably years later since I actually put it out, because who am I to listen to about the first draft of the story? And so who am I to follow, to like my page, to read my blog? One strategy I've had is just putting out some short stories, and I hope to do more. But at the same time, if I start doing more short stories, I will take away from book 2 and book 3. And that's the route. I like novels more than I like short stories. So yeah, there's a lot to consider, a lot to think about. I would just say don't put too much emphasis on social media. Have your accounts, post, share things if you have a chance, but really write your book, fiction, nonfiction, whatever it is. The biggest challenge people are going to have to do are going to have is finishing a book and then editing a book to make it into a good book. and all the research I've done. Beta readers are great, and then professional editing is a must. I will talk about that in the future because I don't have a whole lot of details on right now on how I'm going to go about looking for a professional editor or what steps I'm going to take from here. But I do plan to get it professionally edited. I believe in investing. I believe the front cover is one of the most important things. I was at a bookstore with my son a few days ago, and he was browsing books, but I noticed that, they say don't judge a book by its cover. That's exactly what we all do. We definitely judge books by the cover. I do the same thing if I'm walking down the fantasy aisle. And I guess it hit me more when I saw him browsing, because he was just like, his eyes were just scanning, like the writer didn't matter. He has some writers that he knows, but it didn't really matter. He was looking at covers. If there was an animal on the cover, he stopped and gave it a little bit more time because he likes animal books. And then, did that animal book look like the kind of story that he wanted to read? And if the animal book cover didn't look like something he'd want to read, he didn't even bother with it. He didn't read the back book cover. I actually had to take him and grab one of the books and say, okay, let's read the back to find out what this animal book is about. So that just goes to show, like, putting money into a book cover is really important. Putting money into a professional editor so your book looks good or reads well is also important, but I'll touch on that more later. I'll also have, in the next time I speak directly to you, a back cover kind of blurb about the story I'm writing. I'm working on it right now. I've redrafted it a couple times, but I think it still needs some work. So I don't have it to share today, but I will hopefully next time, along with some writing tips, where I'm at, and all that kind of stuff. But hopefully you got something out of that, a tool you can use or a mistake you cannot make, some things to consider for your own book. And until next time, take care.